Well, hello and welcome to the Race and Rights podcast. This is Nermin Allam. I am the Director of Women's and Gender Studies, and I'm an Associate Professor of Political Science at Rutgers University in Newark. I'm also a faculty affiliate at the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. Today, I have the pleasure of serving as a guest host in the Race and Rights podcast in place of my colleague, Professor Sahar Aziz. The Center for Security, Race, Rights, and Rights, for short CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. The Center does so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit csrr.rutgers.edu and follow CSRR at Rutgers CSRR. And if you find the work of CSSR informative, which I assure you is, please consider making a donation to support the work by going to, again, csrr.rutgers.edu and click the donate button. Please do give generously. In today's episode, I speak with Rusha Latif, author of Tahrir Youth, on remembering and commemorating the January 25th uprising. The January 25th uprising that has led to the ousting of former Egyptian President Hosni Mubarak in 2011. Dr. Latif is an Egyptian-American researcher and writer based in the San Francisco Bay Area. Her work focuses on social movements and revolutions in the Middle East with an emphasis on leadership, organization, and collective action across lines of class, gender, religion, and ideology. Rusha's research has been featured on NPR, Al Jazeera, and Jadaliyya. Her book, Tahrir Youth, Leaders of a Leaderless Revolution, is published by the American University in Cairo Press in 2022. The book is an excellent resource on the Egyptian uprising. It draws on ethnographic fieldwork in Cairo during the 2011 uprising. Rusha traces how young activists became politicized, how they participated in revolutionary organizing, and how they navigated the post-January 25th political landscape. Every year, January 25th asks something of us. We remember, we reckon, we ask. We ask, what does it mean to return to a moment that restructured political imagination, that reordered lives, and that redefined what felt possible long after the chants faded and the political and public space closed off. This episode is part of that reckoning. As we mark the anniversary of the January 25th uprising, we are joined by Rusha Latif to remember and to commemorate the experiences of the young people who animated the moment and who carried its weight forward. As we commemorate the uprising, this conversation invites you. It invites us to think about memory. It invites us to listen carefully, to resist simplification, and to honor the complexity of a revolutionary moment that really still unsettles our present. We are excited to have this conversation with you, Rusha. Welcome again to Race and Rights podcast.
Thank you for having me, Nermin. I'm really excited to be here.
Wonderful. Let me start by asking you, what drew you to researching the January 25th uprising in Egypt? What really compelled you to write your book, Tahrir Youth?
So I was a graduate student at UC Davis when the revolution erupted in early 2011. At the time, I had actually just developed an academic interest in social movement theory and specifically the themes of leadership and youth. And I happened to be looking for a topic for my graduate project that aligned with these interests. And so I really couldn't believe my luck when the revolution erupted in what I considered my backyard. I'm originally Egyptian. My parents were born there and migrated here. I was born here in the US, but I grew up going to Egypt. And I lived there for a few years after I had completed my undergraduate degree. I have family there. The place felt really accessible to me. I knew it very well. I knew downtown Cairo, the Tahrir area. And so just beyond being inspired by what I was seeing, I was also very surprised and taken aback by it. The question on my mind was, how did this happen? What did I miss? Because I actually wasn't particularly, I didn't really have a strong interest in Egyptian politics. It's not something I had followed closely. So I really didn't have any context for that eruption. And it's funny, later I learned as I was doing this research that a lot of the events that happened leading up to it were events that I witnessed when I was living in Egypt, but just wasn't kind of processing it and didn't really understand at the moment what was happening. But in any case, so when this eruption happened and I was trying to seek answers, I was sort of scouring through media to understand like what happened, how did this erupt, what was actually going on. And the narrative that kept coming up, this sort of dominant media narrative, was that this was a spontaneous, leaderless uprising that was powered by social media. So we heard a lot of, we heard about the Facebook revolution, the Twitter uprising, right? But at the same time, there was a lot being said about it being youth-led. And I saw a tension there that I found really fascinating. What did it mean for this movement to be leaderless and youth-led? Like, how could it be both? Which one was it? And so that was the question that intrigued me. And I decided to follow my curiosity to Cairo to seek answers. And so later that summer, in 2011, I went to Egypt. And really, to me, this was also just a very rare opportunity to maybe study or talk to revolutionaries in real time as they're carrying out a revolution. Imagine like having that opportunity to do that with like the Bolsheviks, right? Back in the 20th century. So everything just felt lined up and I felt called and I went to Egypt to do this research. And sure enough, after I got there and started to do some of my early networking to figure out, was this spontaneous? Was there planning behind it? Who should I speak to kind of get to the bottom of the story? I discovered that this framing was, in fact, reductive and inaccurate. There might not have been, leadership in the movement in the traditional sense, if you think about it in terms of like the charismatic leader or figurehead, right? Or the sort of vanguard organization or vanguard party. But that's not to say that it was without leaders. There were definitely people, really critical, important actors who were acting in ways and exercising their agency in ways that were very critical for the movement and its unfolding. And the issue with that leaderless framing is that it kind of, brushes over all of that. And if we accept it without asking questions, then we risk missing out on a lot of really critical learnings from these activists and folks on the ground. And the group that really made me see this was the group called the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, which is the one that I focused on and profiled in the book. And so we could talk more about their story. But, I didn't really have plans to write a book going into this project. It was actually more, FOMO, fear of missing out, that drove me. I was really inspired and wanted to be a part of the movement in some way. And thought this was like the perfect kind of I could get funding from my university and go and do this research. But sure enough, as the process unfolded, I realized that I had my finger on what could be a potentially really important case study, not just on leadership and organization in this historic, Egyptian revolutionary movement, but also in a 21st century revolutionary movement more broadly. So I felt sort of this historical kind of obligation to continue the path to publication.
Wonderful. You truly, in your book, you go against the grain of not easily subscribing to it was leaderless, but really unpacking what does leaderless mean and how can we really study such a movement without just, using shorthand labels that might not fit this. Like the absence of traditional leadership does not equate to the complete action or the complete absence of organization. I love how we talk about that It was truly a moment of hope and opportunities, even in terms of research and writing. And I envy you in being able to have this, intimate and close relationship with the stories and experience of the Revolutionary Youth Coalition. You talk, your book closely follows the 18-day uprising, and you follow it through their stories, right? You challenge the idea that, it was simply a leaderless movement. Who were the Revolutionary Youth Coalition that you wrote about, that you shared their stories, introduced them to the readers who might not have read your work? I would love to hear more from you on what does the experience really reveal about how leadership and how organizing actually unfolded on the ground.
Yes. So the Revolutionary Youth Coalition was sort of an umbrella group of some of the key political youth movements that were active on the ground before January 25th. On the eve of January 25th, and actually the first few days into the uprising, they were just a loose network of activists that had this history of organizing together. And then they later formally consolidated themselves under this name, the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, about 10 days into the uprising. And we can talk about the circumstances that led to that decision, because I think it reveals a lot about what you're asking in terms of, how leadership actually unfolded on the ground and these questions around leadership and organization. So they were diverse in terms of their makeup. They consisted of, groups that were leftist-oriented, liberals, and also Islamists. There was youth from the Muslim Brotherhood, which was kind of one of the more intriguing aspects of their story as a group. They represented, Egypt's diversity in terms of class. You had youth from the lower unpopular classes. You also had upper-class Egyptian youth. Also in terms of religion, there was Muslims, there were Coptic Christians, and then there were people of no faith at all. And they were a really critical group for a number of reasons. And the reason why I focused on them is that they really actually, there's a particular action that they engaged in on January 25th for organizing this, for sort of igniting the revolution. They showed that there was actually intentionality behind January 25th. There was a lot of planning behind it. And this was a group that was engaged in that. Before getting into that story, I think it's important for us to highlight that this group helps us see that this wasn't a revolution that erupted, a movement or a moment that erupted in a vacuum, right? It actually came out of a resistance movement that had been building in the 10 years before. So these activists that I profile in the book, and what I do is I tell the story of how the revolution erupted through, I focus on the narratives of 10 of the activists or the leaders from this group, representing the diverse movements under it, and sort of try to show how the movement emerged through their own personal stories. And so the first thing that we see is that, this whole social media narrative that this just happened on Facebook is problematic because it's reductive. It sort of focuses on the tool rather than the agency of the people using the tool. And so that's what I try to do, is shift the focus to understanding the agency. And once you shift and focus on agency, then leadership comes into view, right? And so my contention is that there's actually no such thing as a leaderless movement. There's always some leadership happening on the ground. And so we see that here. And so in the story, in the case of the Revolutionary Youth Coalition, the way their story kind of unfolds is, one, they're politicized through sort of the historical kind of developments that are happening in Egypt at the time. They're very much a product of the neoliberal crisis that is happening in Egypt and the dramatic turn of Egypt towards this this heavy police state. And we see that kind of show up in their life stories and their experiences with interacting with the police that dominated their neighborhoods from a very young age, their families' experiences with corruption. We see that in just how they experience their urban environments, like where they grew up, and deterioration of like social services and how that affected them. These are all things that awaken their political consciousness. But if we want to start talking about their activation, this actually happened in the year 2000. And so many of them would tell you that January 25th didn't actually start on January 25th. It started with the Second Palestinian Intifada, when Egyptians turned out in the streets in solidarity with their Palestinian neighbors This was sort of after maybe a decade of there not being a lot of protest activity because of the regime's repression against crackdown on Islamists. So this was like a really important moment, and it opened up, it sort of became the entryway for a lot of these activists into anti-regime dissent. When they started making connections between what was happening with their Palestinian neighbors and their own repression in their country. And then this was followed by the anti-Iraq war protests. So together, those two kind of big moments formed the first wave of this regional, of this 10-year resistance movement around regional struggles. And then the one that came after was around sort of a pro-democracy movement with the Kifaya movement, which was Egyptians resisting this idea of Mubarak passing down the presidency to his son Gamal. Then there was a third wave around an explosive labor struggle and the sort of socioeconomic conditions in Egypt radically worsening. And then there was a fourth wave around, you could say, police brutality. Those are kind of the waves, more or less. And the police brutality wave, of course, was ignited by the killing of Khalid Said in the city of Alexandria by the police in broad daylight, which really, I think, also woke up the middle class to the conditions in Egypt and to resistance. So what happens is these activists are kind of embedded in this 10-year struggle. And in the first two waves, they are the ones, they're sort of becoming politically conscious, for the first time. They're becoming socialized into activism. And it's sort of an older generation of political activists that are maybe leading and establishing the movements that are forming around these struggles. And these are activists maybe from the 1968 generation, the 1973 student generations, right? These are political generations in Egypt. But in the second two waves, we find that it's these young people who are now the ones establishing these movements, and they're leading them. And they're coming up with new protest strategies and tactics to kind of try to bring out more people into the streets, right? Their criticism of their elders was that a lot of their activism was geared towards, the more privileged classes of society, right? Like they were holding their protests at downtown government buildings that were inaccessible to the vast majority of ordinary Egyptians. And so the activists were trying to figure out, how do we bring the protests to the poorer people, the people who are really struggling and whose participation we need in order to have some kind of a dramatic kind of change in this country. So one of those kind of tactics was flash protests in popular neighborhoods, right? They were trying to bring political issues to the people where they lived in these kind of impoverished areas. And they were doing it in ways that kind of tested the boundaries with police that dominated those areas. And I highlight all of this because all of this is practice and learning that they now bring into this January 25th moment, right? It's sort of what paves the way for that. And so, as they're developing these tactics and strategies, what they're also doing is building this very loose, decentralized, horizontal movement network that makes space for activists from across the aisle ideologically to step up and join a movement, act creatively and autonomously, and just be leaders in their own way. And so this is a really important thing to keep in mind because this has repercussions for how, leadership processes unfold when we go into the revolutionary moment. But all of this is to say is that these learnings, were things that they mobilized in their planning for January 25th. So when Tunisia happened, before that, the activists actually already had a plan to protest on January 25th. This was Police Day in Egypt. It was a day in which they had historically had protests since 2009 when Mubarak decided to make it a holiday to sort of commemorate the police. And they decided they were going to appropriate it to protest the police state. And so they were making their plans, but suddenly now Tunisia, their peers there had just successfully had removed their longtime dictator, Ben Ali, from power. And that energized and electrified the Arab street across the region, and especially in Egypt. And now the activists were looking at this day of protest they had planned, and they thought, maybe we can actually make this a lot bigger than we thought. And so these kind of tactics that they had been experimenting with were ones that they now mobilize in this moment. And I can tell you more about that story, but I'll pause there to let you interject.
I mean, like, thank you so much for walking us through the period before and during the uprising. I would like us to maybe shift the conversation a bit to the aftermath of the uprising. So, as you know, I'm currently in Cairo, Egypt. We are a few days away from the January 25th anniversary. However, and not surprisingly, the only thing that the official media seem to remember and to commemorate about this date is celebrating the National Police Day.
Yes.
You know, we know and we have experienced how disappointment, how it surfaced throughout the post 2011 experiences that you trace. Yet, we also know and we did experience that this did not simply cancel out the earlier political investment. So, I want to ask you, how does your book help us think about defeat? And how does it help us think about disappointment not as a, complete political failure, but as something that reshapes how activists understand participation, how they understand possibility, and how they understand the costs of engagement?
Yeah. I think that you're right to point out two things, which is that the activists, the defeat that they faced starting in 2013, I think was a major turning point. And I know we skipped over a lot from what happens from 2011, early 2011 to 2013. And maybe I can bring in a little bit of that as I answer this question. But the defeat for them did not mean that they suddenly disinvested from what they started on January 25th. The activists, I think what was remarkable to me was that none of them expressed regret about what they had done, despite the heavy costs they faced in terms of the losses. And some of those were very personal. There's one activist, in fact, I asked him pointedly about his regrets because he lost his brother in 2013 during the massacres that happened after the coup, which was the removal of Mohamed Morsi. His siblings had been arrested and relatives, sorry, not his siblings, but some of his relatives had been arrested. He also lost, I think, up to like 30 friends. So I asked him, do you have any regrets? He himself now is living in exile. He can't go back to Egypt. And for him, there was none because he saw that it was the most worthwhile thing that they had ever done. And it reflected something that was really pure and beautiful inside of them. And there was no way to not do that. There was an opening historically, and they were in this position where they had to move and act. And I think maybe that's where I can just share a little bit about what happened on the 25th, which is, the activists went into this day as activists. They weren't really planning a revolution. There was a joke about it because of what happened with Ben Ali, that maybe it was possible. And so their whole planning around that day just really involved trying to bring out people into the streets. And they had this really incredible strategy that allowed them to effectively do that, which was mobilize a major protest from a popular quarter and guide it into Tahrir on January 25th. And what they did with that protest was bring in the critical mass that facilitated the game-changing siege of the square. And so without that action, we wouldn't probably have an Egyptian revolution and even an Arab Spring to speak of today. So this group is very important, right? And then, there's a story about the challenges they faced after trying to establish leadership and guide the movement. And the problem there was that they weren't prepared because they went into this moment as activists and not revolutionaries. They didn't really have a vision beyond what they knew they collectively didn't want, which actually just even emerged in the 18 days, which is we want Mubarak out, right? But there was no time to deliberate and to figure things out. And I think it's because nobody expected that opening. But they acted on it nonetheless, and they tried to figure out, how far can we push this? And it's great that they did that, because in doing so, they gave us a profound experiment to think with, to see, actually what were the challenges they faced on the ground as they tried to give this leadership and direction. So all of this is to say that this was just part of a process for them. And I think that goes to your next point about, which you accurately named, which is we should see this, as a defeat and not a failure. I think that is a more appropriate language. Just because, like, when we're talking about war, we don't say we failed in war, right? I mean, in war, there's different battles and you win some and you lose some, right? And so the loss, we describe it as a defeat, not as a failure. And so there is a sense of like, I think they can kind of see the longue durée of how this unfolded, starting with, I told you, the pre-2011 period, right? That decade of uprising that sort of gave way to this revolutionary situation they weren't prepared for, but they ran with it. And now there were more learnings that came out of that. So I think the activists have a very acute sense that this is part of a process. And just as that decade was a prelude to what happened in the 18-day uprising and the revolutionary period that came after, the loss and defeat and the sacrifices they made are hopefully a prelude to something else, right? It's a necessary part of this cycle of learning through revolution. One of the activists, Ala Shahba, I had asked her this as well. What hope did she have? And so she was very clear that she thought that, a revolutionary outcome was still possible, but that it was going to take time. And one of the things that she said that really struck me is that I think we had to go through this. Like, you actually have to go through this really difficult sort of trial and error to gain insights, to learn, to recalibrate, to ask new questions about, as you said, possibility, like what's actually possible in terms of what we can achieve. What are the limits we're running up against, or the challenges and the obstacles? What are the risks of certain kinds of participation, right? They couldn't have known unless they experimented and unless they took advantage of that opening that they were given on January 25th. So I love this quote from Ola because I think it captures that. And it actually echoes a sentiment that, something that Lenin said, which is that there are moments in history when a desperate struggle of the masses, even for a hopeless cause, is necessary for the further schooling of these masses and their struggle training the next generation. And so I think that actually captures very well how we should maybe look at the revolution, especially 15 years on, right? I think for me, and what I see in my own research, is that the activists really gave us a masterclass in the challenges of revolutionary organizing in the 21st century. And they gave us a lot of material to think with about, how do you actually succeed at something called revolution? How do we think about how to achieve social transformation in the 21st century? So I think, if anything, my book helps us see how this process unfolds with the actors and agents of the revolution.
This is so profound. You saying you win some and you lose some. This is so profound. Thank you for your wisdom, and thank you for sharing some of the reflections from the activists and their stories. Reflecting on the revolution, Rusha, and your work and your writing and your research, what other lessons from Tahrir do you think are most relevant for activists and for movements around the world today?
Thank you for that question. So I think if there's one major lesson in the book, and just in the revolution in general, it's that revolutionary situations are still possible. So be prepared, right? I think that a lot of the challenges that came out of that moment is that the activists just were not prepared for that opening. And there's no blame on them for that. Like, nobody could have imagined, given how tight Mubarak's grip felt on power, nobody would have imagined that opening, right? And I think the gift that they gave us is that even though they weren't prepared, they ran with it, right? And they gave us, not just in Egypt, I think globally, they inspired the imagination and the hope of people everywhere. And so, in terms of lessons, I think the first one is these situations that we thought maybe were behind us, these revolutionary moments that they were in the 20th century and they're far gone. I think Egypt was the first major, and especially because we all saw it on social media, that showed us, no, this is still possible. And then we saw it happen subsequently in uprisings after that, right? But I think beyond that, it's not so much that there are lessons in my research as it forces us to kind of ask certain questions to help us answer that larger question, is what does it mean to be prepared? And I think that boils down to two areas, which is we have to think preparation has to happen in terms of like vision, project, program, right? And also how you think about organization, movement building vehicles to get there. And those two are very much interlinked. And I think we've seen this a lot, this kind of pattern happen with other kind of major mass movements and uprisings around the world, which is, there is this like moment where people there's a strong appetite for change. They come out into the streets. There's a lot of excitement. We think something's going to happen. And eventually, like, the movement can't really keep up with that energy and figure out how to direct it. And it sort of falls apart. And then we end up actually in situations that were worse than the ones before, right? As we are in Egypt right now. And so the question is, okay, what's actually the vision? And then how do we get there? And you can't really figure out the vehicle, right, until you are clear on the destination. Because, you know, if the destination is very far, like if I'm trying to get from California to Egypt, I'm not going to walk, right? I'm going to figure out the vehicle has to get more complex the farther I need to go and the more difficult it is to get to that destination and the more people we need to get there, right? So those are the two things. And so the questions, I think that there's many questions that I think this experiment forces us to ask to help us maybe answer those questions. So for instance, in terms of vision and project, if revolutions are about capturing state power, right? And this is something, I think, one of the dilemma that activists face on the ground. And I think there are many, including pain points, dilemmas, challenges that are really useful starting points for helping us imagine and ask questions and think of new ways forward. So this is one of them. If revolutions are about capturing state power, what do you do if the power over your state is not within the hands of the ruling class of that state alone, but is actually spread out beyond its borders, right? So we know that the U.S. has power over Egypt through its arrangement with them, with the 1.3 billion in aid it gives them every year, right? We know that the UAE and Saudi Arabia also have influence. I mean, there's geopolitical dynamics that maybe weren't there or as strong in like 20th century movements, right? Where it seemed like, you know, okay, we capture power by just capturing the state. It's not that straightforward in a place like Egypt. So what does that mean for how we like organize what our vision or the project is? Like, can you even have a revolution within just a nation state alone in a place like Egypt or some other country where that's very geopolitically important, right? Do we need to kind of think more about, you know, the vehicle has to be more internationalist, like the movement, and what does that actually look like? And then what's the end game? Is it that we actually is the project of revolution kind of imagining a world beyond the nation state model, right? And I think these are big questions, but I think these are the kinds of questions that we have to ask because we're finding that, you know, we keep coming up against these walls. So that's just one example. And then if we want to think about like in terms of organization, you know, one of the things that we saw in Egypt is that what was really remarkable about the Revolutionary Youth Coalition was, you know, their ability to overcome their ideological differences to come together, to try to organize and mobilize together to realize, you know, change in their country. And obviously that got more challenging after Mubarak left. And, you know, when they were all kind of united on removing Mubarak, that was easier. But the project, you know, what's beyond that? How do we get together to that vision? Again, they ran into challenges and eventually the ideological differences tore them apart. So this again has to do with, well, if we have a clarity of like what the vision is beyond this, then we can think about what are the vehicles that we need to develop that actually not just help us get to that destination, but help us manage our deep differences until we get there, right? To keep the movement on track. And so maybe we need to think a little bit about, you know, like a ladder of shared goals and visions that we kind of climb up against before we start to go in down different pathways, right? So there's a lot of, I think, questions like that the revolution raises for us to think about.
Excellent. It has been 15 years. It has been 15 years since the Egyptian revolution. And the question that I ask myself and I ask my colleagues and I'm asking you is, why is it still important to remember it? Are we collectively engaged in, you know, a self-serving nostalgia that our generation struggle to let go of? Or is it important to hold on to its legacy? And how should we understand this legacy and the legacy of the revolutionaries themselves today?
I definitely don't think it's self-serving nostalgia. I think it's very important to keep remembering and to keep the memory alive. I think we've all heard the saying, memory is resistance. It definitely is in this case. It's resistance, especially in the face of, you know, like you said, right now, the commemoration is coming up and we know that it's not going to be about what happened on January 25th and the people rising to their power. It's going to be about the police state. It's going to go back to its original kind of intention. And so I think keeping that memory is alive keeps the revolution alive itself. And the more we engage with it and ask each other these questions and have these conversations, it means that we're still engaging in this process that you talked about earlier. This is part of the process. This is what revolutionaries gave us to think about. I'm a big advocate of not continuing to talk about it. And I've actually done that since my book has come out. It's a topic I refuse to stop talking about. I think, obviously the legacy of the revolution isn't limited to Egypt. It's what it did globally. I mean, I talk about you and I are based in the US, and it's very clear that even the resurgence of the left movement in the US has a great debt to the Egyptian revolution. I don't see a pathway to that without that uprising. As we know, the Egyptian revolution inspired Occupy, which reignited kind of progressive politics in the street in the US after almost a decade of silence. Really, since the anti-Iraq war movement, there wasn't any kind of cohesive major left movement on the ground. And then obviously that continued to evolve, as they learned from their lessons too, which, they faced similar struggles with the Egyptian revolution, which is protest doesn't get us power. We actually have to figure out how to evolve our tactics and strategies from here. Unfortunately, those opportunities were closed down in Egypt, but they were, folks here in the US were able to continue to kind of take that inspiration and kind of keep evolving it here. So I actually consider all of this part of the legacy of the movement. And I've made a point of actually saying that in forums whenever I get the chance, that I don't see how a Bernie Sanders, for instance, back in 2016, calling for a political revolution would have happened unless Egyptians made it part of our lexicon again, right? This idea of political revolution. You didn't hear that mentioned on a major stage in Egypt, in the US before, Sanders, which, the Occupy movement sort of paved the way to his movement. And then, of course, we've seen all of the damn ballot candidates from there. We've seen, even the rise of Memdani, right? So there's definitely a through line here. But I think beyond that, the Egyptians gave us something really important, and it's that they revealed the kind of limitations of existing theories for how we carry out a revolution in our times, and the need to conceive of new ones, right? And again, these movements that we've had the past 15 years since have also kind of demonstrated this. So how do we go beyond just disrupting the status quo through protest and inducing major structural change and transforming the social order, right? And how do we think anew about questions of leadership and organization and structure in ways that help us create enduring political movements that are capable of taking on these major challenges of neoliberalism, authoritarianism, and imperialism, right? And I think these are some of the most urgent questions on our minds today with everything happening in the region with Palestine and now Iran. And so I think that we cannot belittle or underestimate the gift that Egyptians gave us with this uprising. I think it's going to continue, a gift that's going to continue to give. I still don't think we've seen the full fruits of this movement. And just in terms of theory, I am excited not just about, I need to give a shout out, obviously, to your book, which is an amazing book on studying, women's participation in the Egyptian revolution. But there's a whole canon now of revolutionary thought and theory that just came out of the revolution. And now we're having new theories on understanding counter-revolution and books that are coming out on that. And so I think that definitely there's a lot to remember and to be thankful for 15 years on and to give us hope.
That's wonderful, Rusha. I share your optimism. I share your hopeful note, even as I am surrounded with many of the symbols and the reminders of the post-revolution disappointment and change in political landscape. But you're absolutely correct. You win some and you lose some. I would like us to conclude, Rusha, by inviting you to reflect broadly and to share any additional insights with us in relation to the regional developments, in relation to the politics at the global stage, and maybe the theme of disappointment globally in the current day and time that we live in.
Yeah, thank you for that invitation. I definitely want to acknowledge the moment again that we're in right now with Gaza, that we've been in for the last over 2 years, the devastating developments there with the genocide. And now we have what's happening in Iran. It's been in Lebanon, Sudan. I mean, it's the whole region is in really deep turmoil. I think maybe specifically just talking about Gaza, I just want to circle back to what I tried to illustrate or speak to early on, which is that, the Egyptian Revolution started out as a moment of solidarity with Palestinians in the year 2000. And until today, if you were to ask anybody, they would say any of the activists who were involved. And I think that's something that really struck me in my interviews with activists. I wasn't expecting that, was just how much Palestine meant to them and to what extent they saw their revolution and their struggle as intertwined with Palestinians. I think that it's important to kind of think about these two struggles together. I think they are deeply intertwined with very interlinked histories and bound up futures. And one of the reasons why I'm continuing to talk about the book right now is because I really do think that the lessons in it could help this struggle for Palestinian liberation to help us think more strategically about how we organize our movements for that end game and that goal. And, there's this saying that George Habash, Palestinian activist back in the day, had said, which is that the road to Jerusalem goes through Damascus, Beirut, and Cairo. And I've been thinking a lot about that quote. And I think that time is going to actually prove him to be correct. I think there was something prescient about that quote. And I think it's already happened. I think that road has passed through Cairo route. It passed through Tahrir. And the activists all told me, they actually echoed that quote in we saw it in protest poster signs. We saw it in my interviews. Identification with Palestinians was so strong. They described themselves, in one of these battles with the police during the 18-day uprising, the Battle of the Camel, if you'll remember that, when they were throwing rocks at the police and at the thugs that were attacking them, they imagined themselves as these young Palestinians throwing rocks at Israeli tanks. But this was something that they echoed, which is that we went to Tahrir to liberate Palestine and to liberate to Jerusalem. But the point I want to make is that I do think that road has already kind of passed through Cairo. It might pass through again, but I don't think that it was ever maybe the final stop. Maybe there's sort of this long, sort of sinewy road before it gets back to Jerusalem. And that's this idea of the zeitgeist sort of traveling and the spirit evolving and the tactics and the learnings having to go through other places and destinations. And so I think it's really important to just kind of maintain that long view and follow that trail and that lineage. And that's why I kind of highlighted what's been happening in the US, because I think there's been a lot of evolution and building up on the learnings from Tahrir, even if it's not directly and in part of the folks doing it themselves actually realize that those connections are there. It's happening. And so, even just something like Memdani winning in New York and delivering kind of that blow to AIPAC and the Zionist lobby, which is obviously in its own ways involved in what's the kind of imperial arrangements that keep Egypt repressed, right? And the global order and in the Middle East order. These are all kind of things that we should be thinking about as part of the Egyptian Revolution. And just my hope is that we'll intentionally think about some of the learnings from this movement and the learnings of movements that have built on it to kind of further the cause of Palestinian and Egyptian liberation.
Thank you so much, Rusha. Thank you for joining us. Thank you for your insights. And thank you for sharing your knowledge and your work. I would also like to thank our listeners for tuning in, and of course, the Race and Rights podcast for hosting.
Thank you so much.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.